Well, pressure is mounting tonight on Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito after a report that a symbol used by election deniers was on display at his home just 11 days after the January 6th attack. CBS's Scott MacFarlane on how Alito is responding.
There are calls tonight for Justice Samuel Alito to recuse himself from any cases involving the 2020 election after the New York Times published this photo of an upside-down American flag flying outside Alito's home in the days after the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. The flag upside down became a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement used by rioters and election deniers after the 2020 vote.
This is a member of the Supreme Court. People around the world are looking to them to be unbiased.
In a statement, Alito told the New York Times, "I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs." Neighbors told the paper Alito's wife was involved in a dispute with another family who'd put an anti-Trump sign on their lawn. At the time, the High Court was considering 2020 election challenges and now is weighing critical cases involving Donald Trump, including whether the former president is immune from prosecution for efforts to subvert the election. Alito, who has recently argued free speech is under attack.
Troubled waters are slamming against some of our most fundamental principles.
Was scrutinized last year when a report showed he'd gone on a luxury fishing trip to Alaska paid for by two Republican donors, one of whom had cases before the court. Alito said they never discussed business. Alito's fellow justice, Clarence Thomas, also faced scrutiny after it was revealed his wife, Ginny, sent text messages to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, challenging the 2020 election results. The Supreme Court Code of Conduct says justices should not be swayed by partisan interests and should remain dignified and respectful. Scott MacFarlane, CBS News, the Supreme Court.
Well, staying in the realm of election denial, former New York Mayor and Trump acolyte Rudy Giuliani was served with indictment papers in the Arizona fake electors case during a celebration marking his 80th birthday. Now, Giuliani turns 80 on May 28th, but he was enjoying an early birthday celebration in Palm Beach. That's when he was served the notice of his indictment on charges related to a conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election results in Arizona. The announcement of the indictment came roughly an hour after Giuliani was on social media making taunting posts towards Arizona's Democratic Attorney General Kris Mayes. Mayes responded to Giuliani's post after the notice was given, saying, quote, "Nobody is above the law." A spokesperson for Giuliani said he was, quote, "unperturbed by the birthday bash bust-up." Giuliani was previously hit with a $148 million verdict for defaming two Georgia election workers. Well, speaking of justice, police have arrested the man who allegedly attacked actor Steve Buscemi earlier this month. The suspect is named Clifton Williams. He's 50 years old, and he was taken into custody on Friday following a dispute at a homeless shelter. Police were dispatched after Williams claimed some of his items were stolen. The officers then recognized him from surveillance images and matched him to those images that were released by the NYPD. He was taken in after he confirmed his identity. Police also linked Williams to an additional assault involving a 22-year-old man that took place the same day as the attack on Buscemi. Williams is being charged with misdemeanor assault in that case and felony assault in the attack on Buscemi. Well, coming up next, Biden is campaigning and preparing to give the commencement speech at a Georgia university. But how do students feel about his policy? We'll find out more.